Well, welcome everyone to Inside the Box. Our fall topic is We Can Do Better, and I'm very excited about tonight's talk. Our speaker, Ifeoma Ebo, was brought to my attention by Professor Derek Borowski, and so I am going to hand the mic over to Derek.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, everyone. Some familiar faces in the Zoom. Glad to see when you can see people's cameras. That's awesome. I likewise am very excited for tonight's speaker, the urban designer, planner, architect, and design strategist, Ifeoma Ebo. I first came across Ifeoma's work researching our restorative justice project for our second year design studio almost a year ago now. Rick and I began that research because we've always believed that environmental design should be leveraged for social justice, and we wanted to explore how it might be used specifically to combat mass incarceration. So I was surprised and heartened to learn that in our own mayor's office of criminal justice, there was already a group of people who believed in the power of design, and we're doing just that. And it's there that I first came across some of Ifeoma's projects. Some of you students who were in our class last year have already been exposed to her work, some of the projects she's been involved in, including, among others, the Neighborhood Activation Study, where her team in collaboration with Studio Gang went to long neglected communities and marginalized neighborhoods in New York, listened to and work with residents to identify ways in which small design interventions could improve public safety. She now leads urban design and pre-development initiatives for the Office of Neighborhood Strategies at HPD, that's the Housing and Preservation and Development. She also is founding director of Creative Urban Alchemy, where she consults on equitable design and sustainable development strategy for city governments and civic institutions internationally. The diversity of her 20-year career emphasizes a commitment to social justice and design excellence. She's been very busy. Before her numerous leadership positions at the City of New York, Ifeoma spent several years in South Africa creating strategies to reverse the impacts of apartheid. She also serves on advisory boards for the mayor of Helsingborg in Sweden in their Smart City Initiative, the Association for Community Design, and the Black Space Urbanist Collective. She's also a visiting critic and lecturer at Syracuse and Columbia. Finally, I just think it's incumbent upon me to contextualize a bit the importance of this conversation right now. I, like many, have run out of superlatives to describe this year. Historic, disruptive, unprecedented, and they all feel overused. But it's been different and eye-opening for many and energizing for many of us as well, just to see how people took to the streets in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing this summer. And to our young students, many of whom come here to study from abroad, and I'm learning by meeting you all, many of you haven't really gotten all the history of everything that's gone into all this unrest we've seen in the streets this year. I can't stress enough what a unique moment this is in our country. That this conversation has come to the surface. It's not new, it's just come to the surface for many Americans. And so as you watch and you listen to Ifeoma's talk tonight, I hope you'll consider how in your work, you can be an ally of justice over the course of your design career. Because those of you who had my studio, you hopefully know by now and have embraced the fact that space is political. The built environment is both a product of political forces and a medium for political engagement. And as designers of space, we must make a choice. We can either engage in this conversation or we can quietly cede our agency to other powers. And you don't know what those powers have in mind. You don't know what their motives are. It's often money, unfortunately. And so I'll turn it over to Ifeoma. Maybe, I don't know if we could go off mute for a second and I'll welcome her, give her a warm round of applause. I don't know if that's allowed, Aaron. I'll do it.
Thank you so much. That was such a warm welcome. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the School of Visual Arts, to Derek, to Carol. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to just share my work with your students. And let me share my screen. Okay, can you see? Yep. Thumbs up. Okay, great.
Yep, looks great.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, so thank you again for that introduction. And I think that's just a really wonderful segue to just like the themes in this talk. And this talk was really born out of just like me grappling with a lot of what you spoke of, Derek, and just like trying to put my work in context, and also just, I think it was sort of introspective for me in terms of what do I need to call to the surface now that I'm also working at our housing development agency, and what's necessary to sort of move projects forward at this stage. So, you know, to say the least, 2020 has been a tough year. What the pandemic has revealed to many of us is that despite our efforts to be a more quote unquote smart city, we failed to think about the needs of marginalized communities. Smart became more relevant for a select group of people who can afford to reside in areas that benefit from smart city infrastructure. In addition to the exposure of inequities in the social, economic, and built environment, we are seeing the advent of a new form of discrimination known as digital redlining, which is the practice of creating and perpetuating inequities between already marginalized groups, specifically through the use of digital technologies, digital content, and the internet. The concept of digital redlining is an extension of the practice of redlining in housing discrimination, a legal practice in the US and Canada dating back to the 1930s, where red lines were drawn on maps to indicate poor and primarily Black neighborhoods that were deemed unsuitable for loans or further development. This created great economic disparities between neighborhoods that persist today. To the extent that we have not fully reckoned with this past, I question, how do we move forward? How do we go from a smart to a more thoughtful city? With this prompt, I intend to share a few case studies and tools that strive to address this very question. I want to start with this excerpt from this keynote speech by civil rights leader Whitney M. Young for the 1968 AIA convention in Portland, Oregon. I return to this speech because for myself as a Black practitioner, architect, urban designer, urban planner, urbanist, these words remain as the benchmark for a continuing struggle for equity and justice in the built environment. And I quote, he says, "You are the most distinguished by your thunderous silence and your complete irrelevance." This is him speaking to a room full of architects in 1968. And he ends with saying, "We didn't just suddenly get this situation. It was carefully planned." He was talking about the relationship to the built environment and the civil unrest and injustice that was happening at the time. More than 50 years later, as a global pandemic rips open a gaping wound in our social, economic, and physical environments, the words of Whitney M. Young Jr. remain hauntingly alive. For many of us who have either grown up in and or have worked in marginalized communities of color, the realities of 2020 were nothing new. Over the years and my experiences working at diverse scales, I've gained some insight into the main ingredients of a more thoughtful city. First of all, to be thoughtful is to be concerned for the needs of others. That centers equity as the hallmark of a more thoughtful city. Equity can be articulated in many ways in the built environment, and I will share some tools later for that later. In order to achieve equity, one must understand community need, and that can only happen through an engaged process. But engagement alone does not arrive at a more equitable outcome. The voices and participation of those marginalized must be elevated and included in every phase: process, design, review, implementation, operation, and maintenance. We must be hyper aware of how we are addressing equity in every stage of our work if we are to move the needle on creating a more thoughtful city. Building trust in that process is also critical to ensuring that the outcome is imbibed with justice. Being more thoughtful in our process requires us to pause and operate with an abundance of care for those who have lived in a world that for them seemed careless. In defining justice, I turn to this framework by Seth Elo, a professor of environmental psychology, who calls it the domains of justice. I've used this widely in my work when thinking about how to create a more just outcome. She starts with distributive justice, in which design excellence is upheld in communities that need it most. Secondly, procedural justice is ensuring that the process, planning, and design and operations is inclusive and incorporates diverse voices. Interactional justice in public space is the extent to which the design encourages people to feel wanted or is more spatially inviting. Representational justice refers to the incorporation of the culture and heritage of a community in the symbolism and character of design. And lastly, justice in public space refers to encouraging an enhanced ethic of care between people through the process and final product. For the past year, I've participated in a global advisory board for the mayor of Helsingborg, Sweden, a city that I had never heard of before, but became fascinated with upon visiting last year. In an attempt to compete with neighboring cities of Malmö, Sweden, and Copenhagen in Denmark, the city of Helsingborg put forth an ambitious initiative to become a model smart city by the year 2022. Their goal was to explore how they can use smart technology to facilitate, connect, and create a better life for those living and working in the city. My fascination lied less in their goals of tech advancement, but more in the fact that they had recently opened their borders to refugees from the Middle East and were grappling with a need to address social inclusion in their spatial environment. They are directly asking this question of how do we move from a smart to a more thoughtful city? Their definition of the smart city was not just a city that invests in technological solutions. It's a city that puts its people first, a city that provides a platform for collaboration and participation at all scales, all with the goal of improving the quality of life for those living and working there. They started with the question, how can a city become a facilitator rather than a service provider, and create inclusive systems that encourage residents to get involved in developing the city together? The question they asked of us as advisors was, how do we create an open and trusting culture where co-creation and dialogue with residents are obvious elements in urban development? Where a smart city is led by striving for efficiency as a measure of effectiveness, a more thoughtful city shows consideration for the needs of other people. In 2014, I was living and working in Cape Town, South Africa, when it won the esteemed title of World Design Capital, a city promotion project by the International Council of Societies of Industrial Design to recognize and award accomplishments made by cities around the world in the field of design. With 2014 also marking the 20th anniversary of the ending of apartheid, it was a very exciting time to be a designer in Cape Town. In response to this designation, the city government incorporated design thinking into every facet of its governing structure. Community engaged design at all scales became the ultimate virtue. Cape Town is a beautiful city with an African soul and Western ideals, but despite its attempts to transform itself, it could not shake its own narrative of being an apartheid city. During the advent of the apartheid system, design and planning were used as tools to segregate people based on race and subjugate Black South Africans. Sound familiar? The city center with its beautiful open spaces and homes was reserved for whites, while 30 minutes away, the township communities were reserved for Blacks. You can see from this image that there were strong disparities in the built environment that persist today. I found myself with the opportunity to partner with a group of community leaders to develop a community plan that encouraged co-creation in design and development. Developing this plan forced us to reckon with the legacy of apartheid so that we did not repeat the strategies or intentions used to segregate and subjugate. The resulting plan and urban design framework incorporated best practice in sustainable design, quality open space, spatial integration, and economic development. Most importantly, we developed an approach to community planning and housing development that relied on incremental growth. Starting with stage 1, with their original shack, residents could get support from government in the form of microloans and training so that their home grew with their own personal capacity. We strive to be more thoughtful about how residents can partner with government and financial institutions to co-develop their community in a way that moved with the speed of trust and community capacity. Several years later in New York City, I worked on a series of neighborhood studies and placemaking projects in 15 marginalized communities across the city as a part of the Mayor's Action Plan for Neighborhood Safety. What unites these communities is not only that there is a relatively high concentration of crime, but they are also grappling with high unemployment, overcrowded housing, concentrated poverty, and are some of the neighborhoods that were hardest hit by the pandemic. Through a legacy of institutional racism and marginalization, the people of these communities have experienced significant shocks and stresses to their social, economic, and physical environments. In partnership with local community-based organizations, we created and implemented a built environment community safety capacity building program to develop local leadership in using a design-based approach to community safety. Residents learned about community mapping as a form of storytelling and problem definition. They conducted space audits of their housing developments, their NYCHA campuses, to understand how dysfunction in their built environment creates opportunities for crime. They were also trained in community organizing, creative placemaking, and human-centered design. It was important for residents to contextualize their lived experience into the language of design in order to co-create more thoughtful strategies for transforming public space in their community. In this example in Patterson Houses in the Bronx, the top image shows a fenced-in open space that is quite indicative of much of New York City public housing. If we know our public open spaces to be the places where community happens, where social bonds are formed, where positive memories are shared, then what does that say about a community with fenced-in open spaces? This community in particular was also grappling with mental health and substance abuse as a few of their underlying root causes of crime. The resident team decided to use this open space to create an opportunity for mental health support in the community. The image below, I created as a representation of their ideals for the space as a multi-generational space for respite and togetherness, facilitating an ethic of care in the community. The implementation of this co-designed public space not only fostered an ethic of care, but activated new programs and partnerships in public space. Neighboring community-based organizations and representatives from local banks came together to support this resident team to make their dream a reality. And now this space is no longer associated with perceptions of exclusion. It has become a foundation for new forms of interaction and more thoughtful social engagement. The same goes for this local park in Brownsville, Brooklyn, that was associated with poor perceptions of crime, drug use, and garbage dumping. In one night, the resident team of Brownsville Houses leveraged partnerships with city government and local community-based organizations to create an opportunity for new positive memories to be formed. A silent night party established a new way to light the night in Brownsville and cultivate an abundance of Black joy. The people of Brownsville will never see this park in the same way again because of the way that this design and program met their need and produced new ways of interacting at night. At this point, you may be wondering how you can be more thoughtful in your design and planning practice. I want to share with you a few tools to support your own capacity building towards integrating equity and justice in your work. The public space work I led in the mayor's office culminated in the creation of the Safe Places, Active Spaces Community Playbook. We realized that the public does not see the public realm as a series of spatial slices governed by different agencies. They experience public space as a whole. We created this playbook to help residents who want to be leaders in creative placemaking in their community to better understand the process required to partner with the New York City Housing Authority, the Parks Department, the Department of Transportation. This playbook is a product of a co-creation process between several agencies, community-based organizations, and resident teams at NYCHA. It connects the dots between community design and community safety and presents the transformation of public space to encourage community strength as an alternative to excessive law enforcement. An important part of this work was creating a framework for co-defining and co-evaluating success with residents. This framework presents a series of metrics and indicators that residents can use to understand the impact of their work in their community. It is accompanied by a series of observational and interactive surveys that residents can use to gauge how their neighbors use public space differently or how perceptions of safety and community belonging have changed. It also explores the extent to which new community leaders are formed and trust between residents is built as a result of the new design and programming. Another tool that I'd like to share is a series of guiding principles that I created as a part of a team at the New York City Department of Design and Construction. The Design and Construction Excellence 2.0 Guiding Principles is a publication that outlines shared aims to ensure that equity, sustainability, resiliency, and healthy living are integral to the design process. They directly supported the Design and Construction Excellence Program, an initiative that delivers innovative and enduring public buildings and infrastructure across New York City. The aim of the principles were to encourage transformative design, tease out the greatest opportunities, prioritize tactics that create greatest benefits, and encourage architects to engage in open conversations with users and agency partners on important issues that might not have been considered or fully prioritized before project inception. I focused on the equity guiding principles and shepherded an engagement process to co-create them with the public. Over the course of the year, we held engagement workshops in different communities and engaged with academia to fully define equity in the built environment context. For the DDC portfolio, equity is about access to feeling welcome in a public facility, improved physical access despite language barriers, physical challenges, and visual impairments, access to economic empowerment, access to historic recognition and cultural acknowledgement, access to being included, and access to involvement in the design process. Equity in design strives to advance everyone's participation in the life of the city by centering those who have historically been excluded. These 5 principles for equitable design strive to encourage designers to affirmatively engage with the city's diverse and varying needs and voices, local histories, and global backgrounds. It also seeks to enhance well-being, neighborhood identity, and social cohesion. Equitable design and planning are fundamental values for myself and my colleagues at the Black Space Urbanist Collective. We are a collective of architects, urban designers, planners, artists, lawyers, and activists. We understand that cities are dynamic and require a multidisciplinary approach. We are also building a national network of Black urbanists with affiliates in Chicago, Atlanta, Oklahoma City, and Indianapolis, cities of which are united by grappling with the legacy of institutional racism in the built environment and the threat that gentrification brings to Black communities. We are passionate about working in Black communities in particular and strive for a present and future where Black people, Black culture, and Black assets matter and thrive. And this is sort of our constellation governance framework, where we believe in these sort of spheres, and we call each sphere sort of like our sphere of influence. Where in the center, we start with the Black publics, and that refers to Black communities, Black spaces, any space that sort of constitutes a safe space for Black people to matter and thrive. And that's then surrounded by our different strategies, different ways that we work in the world through customized learnings and trainings, published content. We develop neighborhood strategies co-produced with community. And we also produce urbanist experience to help people understand and learn a lot of the issues that we are striving to advocate for. And then we have a series of our affiliates that I'd mentioned before, and we refer to them as our cousins. We like to sort of use other terminology, and we have our cousins in Chicago and Oklahoma City and in Indianapolis and Atlanta. And then outside of that is our governance structure, our board that you saw in the image before, where we have a content committee that focuses on thought leadership, our managing member committee to focus on our governance, programmings to focus on our urbanist experiences, and our communication committee that deals with our branding. So as we grow our circles, we also grow our ability to engage with other cities and greater series of challenges. And we're in the process of working as a quasi nonprofit and for-profit organization, where we develop neighborhood strategies and customized learnings. And through our partnerships with our cousins across the country, we develop urbanist experiences and published content. So I love this quote by Adrienne Marie Brown, where she's in her book, Emerging Strategy, which actually has inspired a lot of the work of the Black Space Collective. She says, we must imagine new worlds that transition ideologies and norms so that no one sees Black people as murderers or brown people as terrorists and aliens, but all of us as potential cultural and economic innovators. This is a time travel exercise for the heart. This is collaborative ideation. What are the ideas that will liberate all of us? And this really is a powerful quote that really centers the work of Black Space. We really are striving to, we see ourselves as future makers. You know, we do that in co-creation with community. But then we understand that in order for us to arrive at a different future, to manifest a different future, we must manifest that future today. And we must create the culture and the method of operating today that will then produce the future that we seek. Because the future that we're living in right now was created in someone else's imagination that did not see a benefit to Black and brown people. And so with that, you know, our vision is centered in that understanding, where we demand a present and future where Black people, Black spaces, and Black culture matter and thrive. And so over the course of working in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is a historic African-American community in New York, we developed this 14 principles we refer to as the Black Space Manifesto. And it's open source, it's on our website, which is blackspace.org. And the 14 principles are really to guide practitioners, built environment practitioners, students, academics who are working in Black communities. And it's really centered in working in those communities with dignity and acknowledgement of the existing community. And so many of these principles they really are compound, they work together, but they're really thinking about how do you plan and design with the community in a way that's not just about getting their feedback, but actually integrates them in the process of designing? How do you move at the speed of trust in which you only move forward in your project to the extent, at the speed at which people trust the process and participate in the process? How do you eradicate the hierarchy between yourself as a technical consultant and the resident, but acknowledge that their lived experience is just as important as your technical knowledge and understanding? Also, how do you reckon with the past? Acknowledge that there's been a past of injustices that have been imposed upon a community in order to build forward for the future and not replicate what was done in the past. How do you cultivate wealth? How do you sort of identify the seeds in a community that just need a little bit of nourishing to be able to thrive and grow, those seeds of time and talent and treasure, that if they're cultivated through the built environment, they could really thrive and flourish? How do you protect and strengthen the existing culture in the community so that when new development happens, when you build a new building, transform a new public space, it really, the ideas in it, the inspiration out of it is really born out of the existing culture of the community, so that space and place becomes a way of a repository for that culture and history. And then all of these manifesto principles really come together to again, contribute to this idea of manifesting the future. When you begin to integrate these practices into the way we design, the way we develop a project, the way we implement the project and manage and operate that project, we're beginning to change our culture, change the way we operate, and therefore manifesting this future that we seek. But we have to start today. So we, academia and education, educating the new architects and planners of the world, the built environment professionals, all of you, is an important space for us. And so we've used our manifesto, a Black Space Manifesto, to educate students in different institutions, namely Cornell University, working with a local community partner made in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and also with Syracuse University, working with American Civil Liberties Union, both of them working on public housing projects, design studios. And so I'm going to show you just, as I close, I'm just going to share just some of the work that came out of some of those studios. This was one student who was looking at the principle of manifest the future, and he was thinking about the facade of a public housing development and how it can become a place where you can deal with food justice as an issue in the community and create a system where the facade of the building can be used as a way to cultivate and grow food. And so he created this architectural system that people can attach to the front of their windows that then would be a place where they would grow produce, but that this system would not only be a place for them to individually grow produce, but then it could also manifest in ways that could foster personal and communal evolution. So they could grow produce in their apartment, but then also use that produce as a bartering system in the community and sort of a way of protecting and strengthening a culture around food and nutrition. He was also looking at the history of quilt making in an African-American community and how that legacy, that history of quilt making can also be a way of making architecture, as a way of addressing the draping on the front of a building. And so he came up with this sort of contraption made of steel, of aluminum actually, that can be created in the same way as you make a quilt with a family, but that can be draped onto the front of a building as a way of addressing and dealing with scaffolding. So it was kind of a way of reckoning with this past of, you see scaffolding all over public housing, but how can you promote excellence through looking at culture and history? This was another student who was really looking at the manifesto principle of celebrate, catalyze, and amplify Black joy, where she's literally looking at one of the vacant lots in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and thinking about how to actually literally amplify the joy that can happen in that space by using lighting in that space. And so she then translated into looking into the public spaces in between housing in Brownsville, and how she can create this opportunity to not only center the lived experience in Brownsville, but also amplify Black joy. So she heard from a resident in Brownsville that they felt that when they looked up at their housing, that it felt like looking up into the mountains. And so she thought about this idea of being at the mountaintop and having that kind of viewpoint in your community. And so she wanted to create a space where people can feel like they were going up a mountain and having an amazing view of their community. And so she sort of created this zipper shape that then created all these opportunities and spaces for togetherness, for people to strengthen culture and enhance the nature of this public open space. And that at night, this space could also be a place where people could linger at night and feel safe and enjoy the views of their community that they haven't been able to experience before. This is a project in Syracuse University where students were looking at Pioneer Homes, which is one of the first public housing developments in the country. And but it's experienced a legacy of injustice as a result of redlining and as a result of a highway program, a Federal Highway Act program that was implemented in the 50s and 60s, where federal highways were built in many cities across the country and completely decimated African-American communities. So this design project was really using design as a way to reckon with that past and build a new future and really dig in and learn about the history and culture that existed before that freeway came to be, and figure ways to return to that and bring the essence of that back into the community. And so they thought about ways to do that socially, economically, and culturally through design. And so I end with just returning to the three key aspects of designing a more thoughtful city it must be co-created with community and really consider residents as partners in the process of making. It must be focused on equity and justice, particularly now more than ever, as a way of addressing the inequities in the built environment. And also moving at the speed of trust acknowledges that there has been a legacy of injustice, and that must be reckoned with and acknowledged, and trust must be built in this process of making new cities, new places, new spaces, new built environments. And so I love this quote by Octavia Butler that I'll leave you with. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And what this speaks to me is that at every stage of your work, there's an opportunity to create change. And it can be something so small as sending an email to something as large as designing a new community, or even designing a new interior space, designing a new building. That there's an opportunity there to change, and also to be changed by the process of making that. And the only thing that's going to last in the end is that change that you've created. So thank you again to SVA and to this opportunity for this opportunity to share my work. I'm really looking forward to the questions and and discussion.